TITANIC TALK with Nelson Aspen and Alexandra Boyd. Here we feature stories from the independent documentary Ship of Dreams Titanic Movie Diaries and everything else to do with the iconic ship. From James Cameron's epic groundbreaking movie to the history and legacy of Titanic herself. Join us and our special guests as we continue the 25th anniversary celebrations of Titanic. This is your first-class ticket to everything aboard the Ship of Dreams.
I am beyond excited. I am Nelson Aspen. This is Titanic Talk. So we're going to talk all things Titanic, but there are so many other things we could be talking about with the esteemed author, Gareth Russell, who just happens to have written this extraordinary book, The Ship of Dreams, The Sinking of the Titanic and the End of the Edwardian Era. And I'm halfway through it. I can't put it down. I am thrilled that my co-host, Alexandra Boyd, and I are going to get to spend some time with him today. Alexandra, of course, the filmmaker behind the not uncommonly titled Ship of Dreams Titanic Movie Diaries. So all of our worlds are colliding. Alexandra, you don't have any proprietary issues with Gareth, do you?
No, none whatsoever. No, and I don't think the people who gave the Ship of Dreams her title would ever have dreamed that we would still be uttering those words 111 years later. And certainly from a filmmaker's point of view, and in our documentary, we found that dreams of the ship, dreams of the actors who were part of James Cameron's film, the dreams of the fans who keep the legend of Titanic going. There's a lot of dreaming going on, and I am fascinated to hear Gareth's point of view on the very subject.
It's a dream come true for Titanic fans. Gareth, welcome to Titanic Talk. Thank you for taking time with us today.
No, it's an absolute pleasure to be here, Nelson. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, what's so interesting, I was aware of you previously from your latest book, which is Do Let's Have Another Drink, The Dry Wit and Fizzy Life of Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, which is extraordinary. Then a mutual friend of ours, the amazing author Anne Seba, said, oh, if you're doing Titanic stuff, you need to talk to Gareth. And I did a little Amazon searching. Here it is. We have all these other subjects in common. But so with this sort of ubiquitous subject matter of yours, why the Titanic? What was the starting point for you with Titanic?
Probably home was Belfast. Certainly, that it really was. My great grandparents, two of them, Thomas and Elizabeth, had seen it when they were children. Elizabeth's memories were a lot less clear. She was about 2 years younger than Thomas, and she also. I mean, it was interesting because it sort of told me to look at two people can see the same things, but depends on where they're viewing it from that it becomes different. She came from a much wealthier background than Thomas did. And so her memories were of a beautiful ship sailing up Belfast Lough, and his memories were of what it took for his father to help build it in the shipyards. It's a very, very different story.
And we have had several episodes of Titanic Talk addressing Belfast, Belfast's sort of pride and pain as it relates to Titanic. So, do you spend time in Belfast now? Like, what is your relationship with Belfast and the new Belfast, the post James Cameron Belfast?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I suppose. Yeah, Belfast is still home for a lot of the time. I mean, I travel a lot for work, but when I'm there, I try to spend most of my time with my family and friends are still there. It's wonderful, and it's a very interesting, vibrant city. Like a lot of cities, there's a lot of pain in its past, but there's a great deal in Belfast because of the 1960s through the 1990s. But Belfast really was having a pre-echo, a precursor, the first thunder rolling behind the clouds when the Titanic was built. It was this moment. It was the pivotal moment. 1911 and 1912 was a moment of reckoning about what side were you going to fall on the question of Irish independence or Irish home rule from Britain. And Belfast fell very strongly into the pro-British camp. I mean, it had a Catholic minority in the West with a fascinating history, but overwhelmingly this was a city that ticked all the boxes for being unionist, to stay part of the union with Britain. It was predominantly Protestant. It was predominantly industrialized, and at the heart of this, at the heart of the core argument of an Irish independence would be a disaster, was the suggestion that the economy of the northern counties was so different from the southern Irish counties that the United Irish were, that Ulster should stay part of Britain even if the rest of Ireland wanted to leave. The shipbuilding industry was a massive part of that argument, and so the Titanic became, and the other ships, but the Titanic in particular, became this living symbol of the unionist pro-British argument, and the shipyard was to become a flashpoint for tensions among the city's working classes. And so when the Titanic sailed and when the Titanic sank, it fed into this political tension that was happening in Belfast, and it led to these sort of like ridiculous urban legends that actually the yard number was, if I got this right, 340409. And if you hold it up in a mirror, that spells no pope, and that it was and then if that was God punishing the ship. Its yard number was 401, and also the letter 9 doesn't look like the letter N, but it's the number 9 doesn't look. But anyway, it's a ridiculous story, one of many that the Titanic has generated. But unquestionably,
there are many conspiracy theories. You talk about that in the book about was the Titanic just the Olympic disguised for insurance purposes? I mean, these amazing stories, meticulously researched. This is not a fluffy book, but what I love is when you're talking about the end of the Edwardian era. Was the sinking of Titanic the same as sort of was it a 9/11 style event? A once in a lifetime change, a global shift.
Yeah. I suppose, unfortunately for the Edwardians, no, it wasn't once in a lifetime. And I would, if I had to do the 9/11 comparison, I actually would probably link that to the Lusitania, because I think the Titanic didn't quite have the political ripple effects that the Lusitania would have and that 9/11 would have, and certainly it wouldn't push countries closer to war. But if you were to look at the kind of psyche shattering impact, I think the Titanic did go a long way in doing something, because it really jolted and maybe even shattered society out of a supreme confidence in progress. It imparted a lesson that I think we're starting to forget again, in that technology should not always be trusted, and it should not always be assumed that it will lead to the betterment of the human race, and that there will be serious risks with it. And above all, complacency in the face of technological innovation is something that we should be worried about and that we should be profoundly cautious of. It also, I think, showed people, particularly in Britain, and I also think to a degree in America as well, although to a less jolting nature, that sometimes, and again, this is where I think it syncs up even more today, the technology can be moving so quickly that legislation has not caught up with it or even made a serious attempt to catch up with it. So you had laws in Britain that sort of did the lifeboat requirements, but they did it by tonnage. And so the top layer of provisions was for a 10,000-ton ship, which 20 years before was pretty much as big as you could get. The Titanic was 46,000 tons. The nautical technology leapt so quickly that the laws just didn't feel they needed to, or there wasn't a sense of urgency to catch up. And that, to me, is sort of, as we're staring down the barrel of the gun with artificial intelligence, is exactly what we are doing today. And I wish this book was less relevant than when I'd written it, but all of a sudden, I mean, reading some of the stories this weekend, I thought, oh my goodness, we're at full speed again. We're receiving ice warnings from everyone from Elon Musk to Pope Francis, and no one's slowing us down. And I was going to say,
is Elon Musk the new Bruce Ismay? I don't know. It's interesting. But although you do make the argument that Ismay may have been unfairly mischaracterized.
Oh, totally.
Because Alexandra, with her audition to be in James Cameron's Titanic, that was one of the connecting points between us. Was she didn't know much about Titanic, but she had to write a monologue to audition for it, and I was like, oh, I know about Titanic. Let's do you Countess of Rothes, and you have the Countess of Rothes as a very important character in the book.
Yeah.
And she's so different, I think, from the portrayal in the film. Alexander didn't play the Countess in the film, but she's much, I don't know, she's much more likable and real as you describe her to us, as is Thomas Andrews, like who you refer to as Tommy Andrews. Very likable. Thomas Andrews in particular, liked by the firemen as well as the first class. So I want to bring Alexandra into this discussion here now, because I'm getting carried away. I don't want to monopolize everything. What are your who are your heroes of Titanic? I'm guessing it's who I'm reading about, but who are your favorite characters?
Mine, I suppose I would have to say Lily Rothes was a tough one to beat. I mean, she really, the Countess is. And yes, I think this was very definitely. I mean, Tommy's such a love. It was the nickname for his family and friends, and it turned up so often in the letters. It seemed like the best way to refer to him for consistency's sake. I mean, my very few hard and fast guiding rules in life, but I always think the person who's nice to you but not nice to a waiter is the person you should watch out to. How you treat a waiter is, or people who can't answer back to you because it's their job, tells you a lot about someone. And Tommy Andrews was always nice to the waiter. The staff, the people who worked for him or people who worked near him loved him, and he was fundamentally a very, very good man. But probably for me, the Countess of Rothes just had this irrepressible urge to be useful. And that to me is a great trait. It's not goodness, I'm sure there's plenty of goodness of heart. She trained as a Red Cross nurse when she was a countess. There was no need for her to do that socially. But I think for her, goodness was actions rather than just words. And it's very easy to sound good and not be good.
One of the things that came out of, I found a small part of her account, her survivor's account, if you like, and I used it at the very end of my monologue for the audition. But prior to that, when I met Mally Finn, who was the casting director, there were no lines for this character. So she was like, well, come back next week and bring another actor and, improvise a tea party scene. And ironically, I couldn't find anybody to come with me because they wanted to be invited themselves. I was like, okay, fine. So that reduced me to having, or she said, write something. But she said, look at Gertrude Stein and look at the early feminists, because that was where the Rose character was leading. And she must have known more than I did at the time that what you're describing about the Countess of Rothes was that she was as well, contained by her corset and her title and her money. And the only powers that she would have would be to become a nurse and to do these things and to steer the tiller of lifeboat number 8 and be, if she was outspoken and intelligent, that she had to sort of manipulate her way around society as it was at the time. And that was very much the starting point for my monologue.
Well, that would make, I mean, she is fascinating. She doesn't fall into easy categories. She was very right wing in a lot of her other views. I mean, she was a conservative, but she was also a suffragette. She was incredible. She was president of the local Women's Unionist Association, very strongly opposed to Irish independence. She ran a lot of charities about to set up sort of proto-National Health Service free clinics in her husband's domains in Scotland. She was wildly in love with her husband, Lord Rothes, and a devout Christian. And so to me, she was very much off her time, and yet she also has this sort of eternally relatable zest for life. So yes, she was an extraordinary character. And also, I suppose, not that they weren't the focus, but I think it's very hard to find anyone more heroic than the engineers who chose to stay below deck and keep the lights going for as long as possible, because the impact of what the electricity cutting would have been during the sinking is just really too horrible to imagine. To keep the lights going until 2 minutes before it disappeared is absolutely extraordinary. So there are many, many heroes in the Titanic. I think I actually came away finding very few people who behaved abhorrently. There was one or two. that's stuck in my head. But the majority of people, I think, maybe behaved weakly, or they behaved very, very well. So in some cases, the sinking of the Titanic is a story of human stupidity, but the evacuation of the Titanic is the story of human goodness. So there's two very different things going on there.
I don't think that would happen today. I think about just sort of the way society, the way people are today, that we sort of live in a more selfish time. It doesn't mean that there aren't heroes every day. We hear wonderful stories, thank goodness. But that sort of chivalry, certainly, I guess chivalry is what it is. It just doesn't exist anymore. So I don't think it would be the same kind of thing. What I'm fascinated and enjoy so much in this is some of the details that you share that in all of my years of Titanic study, I did not know. I didn't think about like the mattresses. You talk about how they had put in firm mattresses and the problems with the radiators. Just tell us about that and where you came up with this information and share those stories.
Well, it was Bruce Ismay who went on the maiden voyage of the Olympic, and he realized that, and he was in B deck, which was sort of was probably where the best suites were. And you traditionally, first class didn't have to be at the top, but it did have to be in the middle. It was midships, because that's the most stable part of a large ship, or it was then. And so, but the upside of that is it kept you more stable than, say, the front or back of the ship. But it also was much further above the engines than they would be. So if it was a nice soft mattress that would work really well in a hotel, it picked up on the vibrations of the engines from below. And so Ismay said, look, we really can't charge this for these rooms when there's a slight vibration for 6 nights across the Atlantic. So they were changed for the Titanic. They put in firmer mattresses. And then the rest of it was people who, the testimonies from the survivors, and also and people who'd known Thomas Andrews. He was the one making lists of things like he wanted that the first class writing room was the least used room, and there was something unesthetically appealing about the first class coat hooks. The radiator came from this testimony of, there were a couple of second class passengers who, this mother and daughter pair, Emanita and Lottie, I think, Emanita Shelley and Lottie Parrish, were among the most insufferable people I've ever written about. And they were traveling in second class, which I think chagrined them hugely. And they had their cabin radiator didn't work. It was an upgrade. And they wanted this upgrade that was denied them so badly that it continued to be the focus of their complaints after it sank. Like, they were trying to quiz third class survivors, like, did you have problems with food? And the radiators right now are not our major.
Couple of Karens, early Karens.
Yeah. It's not so different from.
Yeah, they're the alpha Karens. But so they mentioned it, and also there was it was Jack Thayer, a 17-year-old in first class, remembered that they had the opposite problem. Theirs was stuck way up high, and they couldn't. It was that sort of, because you do still have that in hotel rooms sometimes. You arrive in and you think it's sort of heated to just below the surface of the sun. And so they had to open their windows even though it was a bit of a cold night. So there were little things, really small things, but
you described them as teething pains because the ship was new, you were going through those kinds of things. And what I hadn't realized, I think all of us who call ourselves Titaniacs, I was a bit surprised that the ship wasn't full. Sort of, we interpret the story as, oh, it was such a fabulous ship. Leonardo DiCaprio's character was so lucky to get the tickets. It must have been jam-packed. But no, it was not at all at full capacity. Even the Countess was able to change rooms because there was an opportunity to switch between classes if need be. So it could have been so much worse had it been at full capacity, eh?
Yeah, if it had been at full capacity, it would have been, not infinitely worse. It would have been probably about 50% more lives lost. it really was just to do with the time of year that it sailed. There was something logical about not putting a maiden voyage at the peak season in summer when the ships were usually at their fullest, because it gave you a chance to test out the teething problems. And yet, when the Countess of Rothes arrived, I mean, my theory about why she asked to change cabins, she stayed in the same corridor, but she was a lot further in, was that the cabin she was in wasn't quite near the staircase, and I think did she wonder, oh, there'd be too much noise, which I think a lot of people would be concerned about with a room next to the staircase. So they moved her on the same corridor. Yeah, it was about a third full in first class, half in second class, and 2/3 in third. And part of that was just, it's so important when you're looking at how the upper classes lived at the time, is it was a calendar based year. You did things in seasons. Everyone went somewhere, so for instance, this April, there's the reason why there was almost no, not none, but very, very few major British socialites or upper class people on board, was because the season was about to start in London. There was going to be the Ascot and Wimbledon, and everyone was converging in London for the summer parties. The Countess of Rothes was going because her husband was on a government mission to America, so she was unusual. And whereas Americans were decamping home after winter spent on the Riviera, so they were going back to be in the Hamptons and Cape Cod and everything in time for Memorial Day. So very much so that the busy season of travel was summer, not as the season was gearing up to start. So I think that was part of the explanation for first class. And in general, second class, it's starting to emerge into a slightly more touristic experience. So again, professional people will have time to go on holiday in summer, not just after Easter. And third class, I mean, it's the most full, and obviously emigration, sorry, isn't usually too seasonally based. But in April, I looked at sailing figures for the Olympic, and around the same time, it was around the same passenger amount. So yeah, no, it was not fully booked at all. I mean, there was room for about another 600 people in first class. So in fact, had it, I mean, just trying to do very, very basic maths, 400, 200. Yeah, there's room for another 1,200 passengers on board. So they likely would have brought the death toll up to about 2,700.
Well, Alexandra is a great example because obviously her role in James Cameron's Titanic created its own Titania enthusiasm in her. Some of us have had it longer. We've spoken to young people who only came to Titanic, they saw the movie when they were 6, and all of a sudden they've become Titanic enthusiasts. You have your origins in Belfast, but speak to the dramatic interpretations. Starting with Dorothy Gibson and working their way up through James Cameron to all the, I'm sure there will be more. I'm sure there will be a Netflix series where they will spend 55 episodes to tell the story of Titanic.
Well, you could. I mean, I suppose there's so many stories. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the first movie was very controversially made with one of the survivors starring in it. And it was a very early example of questions about profiting from tragedy and was it appropriate to be making movies like this? And was Dorothy Gibson, who was one of the highest paid movie stars in the world at the time, was she profiteering off a tragedy that she barely escaped, from with her life? And there had been a movie before about the assassination of one of the Tsar's uncles that people had pushed back on taste-wise and said this is too recent to do this. But Saved from the Titanic really divided people. But it was like many things that divided people. It was a huge commercial success. The first talkie was a movie called Atlantic in the tail end of the 1920s. And they filmed on a real passenger liner. There's this enduring myth I thought cannot be true, and it wasn't true, that they filmed it on a White Star ocean liner called the Majestic. And I thought, there's no company on God's earth that would let you make a film about the worst moment in their history on board one of the ships. It was filmed on another, I think, a P&O ship. One of the most interesting movies is a movie just called Titanic that was made by the Nazi Minister for Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels. And interestingly, it's the first one that puts Ismay as the villain. And it really makes him the Ismay that we have seen in nearly every film since. Effete, he's the reason they keep pushing the speed. And it's easier because Ismay survives. you can't really blame Smith for it because it looks a bit cruel because he dies. But it's very much the 1943 Titanic is an attack on British arrogance and American greed. It was part of this massive series of Third Reich produced propaganda films to attack Britain and America. There's probably the one I used to watch obsessively as a child. I loved this film. I still do. It was one called A Night to Remember in 1958, produced by a Belfast guy called William McQuitty. But it's hard. It's very, very hard. I sometimes watch the James Cameron one, and I'm really struck by what seems to me to be two stories. And I get the impression, I could be completely off kilter on this one. I get the impression that as he went into it, he became more and more interested in the real story and less interested in Jack and Rose. That's my impression of it anyway. But
as
certainly Jack
a
and Rose,
filmmaker now,
yeah.
myself, and because I was slightly sort of deer in the headlights when I did the film, none of us knew at all what we were part of
We're doing.
while we were experiencing it, and of course, looking back, it was extraordinary at the time, but looking back, it was really extraordinary to be part of that. But what Jim has said many times, I think, is that yes, I know my characters are fictional, and that sort of rubs against a lot of people who say there's so many true stories on the ship. Why did you do that? And his intention was to, in casting actors such as myself, who ended up sort of getting shaken down into much lesser participation of the story, because the Jack and Rose story kept coming up. And I see this in my own filmmaking and editing. It's like you're really rewriting a fourth time or a third or fourth time when you edit. And the stories start to sort of form themselves. And of course, he had shot the Jack and Rose, and he'd also shot an awful lot of the real characters. And he said it just kept coming back to that, because you're watching the ship sink while you're watching their tragic love story. So it's all going on around, and it became that. Whereas maybe when he started off, I think you're right. He wanted all the details to be there, with the first class dining room and the music that was playing, and the carpet that was woven and reproduced, and the costumes and the props and everything. That was all there. But as he went through the edit, and as they had to reduce it from a 5.5-hour cut to at least a watchable 3 3/4 hour cut, all of that stuff sacrificed for that. And the net result of that, I will always say, is that it introduced it continues to introduce new generations of young people to be engaged in the story of Titanic. I feel like Jack and Rose are the gateway drugs to Titanic. If you're going to be interested, that's what draws you in. And actually, whether he intended it or not, it's quite genius.
And you're right, Gareth, about Cameron, because ever since he finished Titanic and it became the hit that he wasn't sure it would be, he did The Ghosts of the Abyss, which was more documentary style. Then he's done so many documentaries. Could they have both fit on the floating panel? Like he is more interested, I think, in the history more now than ever, than in the Romeo and Juliet.
Oh, and he's been down to the Mariana Trench like 3 times, and he's been to the wreck 9+. He'd been down 9 times when I met him 25 years ago. I'm sure he's been again. And then look at Avatar. Whatever you think about Avatar, it's all about the water and underwater and living a life that could be.
And Gareth, because my eye is on the clock, and I know that our time is shortening now. The bow is, maybe the wash has just come up over the bow for our time. So, but I do want to talk about your other books, because what your expertise in the royal family is extensive, and that's sort of what brought us together through a mutual author friend. Tell us what's occupying most of your time these days.
Well, I was doing some of the coronation coverage in London, and I've just finished editing an American and British book called The Palace, which is about a history of Hampton Court Palace told through the people who've lived there over the years. So it's So it's been a huge amount of fun to do, and I fell in love with Hampton Court as a place. It is an absolutely extraordinary set of stories. So that's what I've been working on at the minute, and that's out in the UK and Ireland and Australia in August, and in the US and Canada in December. So the next thing will be picking the imagery for it. So that's kind of what's taking up my time at the moment.
I always love the kitchens at Hampton Court. You can
Yeah, they're fantastic.
Just on the food and that big cauldron where they would make the steak and kidney filling for all the pies.
For all the pies, yeah, absolutely. I love the kitchens too. Probably some of my favorite rooms, I think.
All your books are supposed to be like your children. You don't love one any more than any other, but we just want to make sure that we're very in love with your Ship of Dreams title. Of all your children, this is currently our favorite. And
Thank you very much.
When you're in New York, we'll go down to the Strauss Memorial Park for a cup of coffee, and we'll do some cooking at Hampton Court.
Perfect.
If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review. And if you'd like to hear more podcasts like this, hit the subscribe button. For information on where you can see Ship of Dreams, Titanic Movie Diaries, go to shipofdreamsfilm.com. Titanic Talk is a production of Ship of Dreams Film Limited. At Titanic Talk, Nelson and I are looking for the ultimate superfans. Do you have a passion for James Cameron's Titanic or any of the other screen adaptations? Are you an amateur historian with a vast knowledge of the ship herself? We would love to invite you on our podcast. Come and talk Titanic with us and all things aboard the Ship of Dreams. To reach out, email info@shipofdreamsfilm.com. We look forward to hearing from you.